All right, we're talking today with Trisha Torres of Caledonia, Michigan. When she was in the service, her last name was Sexton, so this is Trisha Sexton Torres. The interviewer is James Smither of the Grand Valley State University Veterans History Project. Okay, Trisha, start us off with a little bit of background on yourself, and to begin with, where and when were you born?
Sure, I was born in March of 1969 in Brownsville, Texas. Born in the same hospital as my father was 25 years before me. My dad had been in the Marine Corps and had gotten out of the Marine Corps, met my mother, I was born, and when I was about kindergarten age, he went back into the Marine Corps.
Okay.
And so at that point, we started moving around.
Mm-hmm.
And I spent about half my growing up years on the east coast of North Carolina near a military base called Cherry Point, which is where my dad, but I also spent time in Okinawa, Japan as a kid, 29 Palms, El Toro, California, and
So where did you finish high school?
I finished high school at West Carteret High School in Morehead City, North Carolina.
Okay. All right, and then what did you do once you finished high school?
I went to college. So I studied nuclear engineering at Texas A&M. I loved math and science and wanted to be an engineer. But when we lived on Okinawa, Japan, I went to school on an Air Force Base. And I thought, you know, this Air Force, they know how to treat their people. My school, I was in 8th grade, and my school had a swimming pool. And I thought, oh, this Air Force is pretty good.
Mm-hmm.
And my fate was sealed at that point. From that point on, I wanted to be in the Air Force. I liked math and science, so wanted to be an engineer. Didn't really even think much about how those two things would coordinate themselves and work out, but I did study nuclear engineering at Texas A&M, and a crazy story is I really wanted to be a chemical engineer, as I loved chemistry. But when I was applying for scholarships at Texas A&M, they had a list of things that you could circle, and chemical engineering wasn't one of them. Nuclear was, and I thought, well, you know, nucleus is chemical, sure. So I circled that. 5 years later, I had a degree in nuclear engineering, and so that's what I did after high school.
Okay. And then once you graduate from college, now what do you do?
So I did ROTC at Texas A&M, which is a little different if you're not familiar with it. They have a Corps of Cadets there.
Yes.
And my high school had a brochure in the counselor's office that said they commissioned more officers than any other school except the academies. And I had done an application for the Air Force Academy, and I could not do a pull-up. At the time, part of the physical was you had to do one pull-up, and I could not do a pull-up, so I did not pass the physical. And so I was like, okay, well, my alternate plan was Texas A&M. It's the only place I applied. You know, mind you, I'm on the east coast of North Carolina. Most of my friends are going to NC State and UNC, and I was one of the weird ones that was going a long way away. But my dad and I, because he was in the Marine Corps, were Texas residents. And so I needed to go somewhere in Texas to be able to afford it. And so I ended up at Texas A&M. I got accepted. My dad drove me in my little Ford Escort to Texas A&M. We really didn't know what to expect. We show up, and they give us a list of things I'm not allowed to have in my dorm room. And it was most of the things I had brought with me, like curtains and bedspreads and pillows. No TVs, I think we might have been able to have a radio, but not use it. And so he rode a Greyhound bus back to North Carolina with all of that stuff in 2-foot lockers. And they issued me what I needed. It's kind of like a mini military school in this giant, at that time, probably 45,000 students.
So you were part of the Corps of Cadets?
I was.
Okay, yeah.
Yep, for 4 years. And then my 5th year, I was an RA, resident assistant in a dorm while I finished my last year of college.
Okay. So what sort of training did you actually get in the ROTC stuff?
So at A&M, it's a 24/7 gig. And so discipline, how to march, how to wear a uniform, a lot of leadership training, different types. My 4th year, I was the commander of my little unit. And at the time I was at Texas A&M, when I started, we were segregated. So it was all female units. There were 2 of them. And then there were the male units. And so I was in the Air Force female unit. And but when I became a senior, at that point we integrated, or were starting the process of integrating my junior year. And when I was a senior, my little squadron then was integrated. So there was men and women there, which was an interesting time at Texas A&M. And a lot of the females that started with me at Texas A&M didn't finish. There were actually 3 of us. Think about this. There may have been 4 of us out of the 25 freshmen that started that wore what are senior boots at Texas A&M. The seniors in the Corps of Cadets wear long riding boots, and so we wore senior boots, the 4 of us, and finished the Corps of Cadets, the 4 years in the Corps of Cadets. It's a voluntary unit, but the ROTC is embedded within the Corps of Cadets. So I was ROTC, Air Force ROTC. After my first semester, I did good in college. I got a ROTC scholarship for my 3.5 years, the next 3.5 years. So.
Okay. So the women you mentioned, the other women that started with you, they left the program. Did they do that when it went co-ed, or did they leave earlier?
No, most of them, I would say between freshman and sophomore year, decided, this is way more than I had anticipated. One of the things about the Corps of Cadets, if you joined it, you were guaranteed on-campus housing.
Yeah.
And so a lot of them, I think, thought, well, I'll get on-campus housing this way, not realizing that it is no kidding, you live with your unit, the upperclassmen can wake you up at any hour. I mean, it's a full-on military experience.
Yeah, it approximates what the service academies do, or the military schools like VMI or something.
Yeah.
Okay, so you're kind of getting all that. So that was really it, more than just having to be integrated with the men.
No, it was nothing to do with integration. As a matter of fact, from a female perspective, we were ready and thought it was the right thing to do. The male perspective was different at A&M. A lot of the men in the boys, really, in the Corps of Cadets, came from a legacy of people that had been in the Corps of Cadets. They had had stories their whole life about what it was like, and it's different. It was different already, but it was changing, and in many ways for the better. There were many that were hesitant to move into an era where there was integration. It's very different now. I got to meet the first handler for the mascot. Sorry, it makes me a little bit emotional, but so Reveille is the Texas A&M mascot, and the first female handler was many years after I left. But I got a chance to meet her and just tell her how proud I was
Mhm.
that she had made it through and was able to do that.
Mhm.
And it just kind of made it all worth it, you
Yeah,
know,
yeah.
all the hard times that the females had in the Corps.
Right.
So
Okay. All right. And so now you've done Air Force. Now, at this point, once you get the degree, do you go straight into the Air Force?
I do, yeah. A lot of times there's some kind of technical training that occurs after college so that you learn kind of your whatever skill you're going to have
Mhm.
in the Air Force. But for nuclear engineers and I think physicists and a few other engineers, there's nothing else that the Air Force really, there's on-job training about your specific job that you're going to have. But yeah, I went straight to my duty station. I had one ribbon on my uniform. I remember my first boss was a captain, and he probably, like within the first hour, he's like, "What's that spot on your uniform?" And I looked down, of course, it's my one little ribbon, my little training ribbon that I had, and I was like, "Okay, you got me."
Mhm. All right. So, and so where were you assigned first?
I was assigned Patrick Air Force Base to a unit called Headquarters Air Force Technical Applications Center. And it is the one unit in all of the Department of Defense that does nuclear treaty monitoring.
Mhm.
And so I went there as a nuclear systems evaluator and was monitoring other countries and making sure that they were abiding by the treaties that they and America had signed.
Okay. And where is Patrick Air Force Base?
Sure, it is just south of Cocoa Beach, Florida.
Okay.
Yeah,
All right.
on the East Coast.
Okay. And when did you get there?
I got there in January of 1993.
All right. And how long did you stay there?
I stayed there for, I think it was 3.5 years total.
Okay.
I had 2 different jobs while I was there. One was the nuclear systems evaluator, and one was like a resource advisor for the directorate that I was part of, which was great skill to have for later in my career.
So what did you actually do in that job?
In the resource
Yeah,
advisor
yeah.
job, well, I had one master sergeant that worked for me, which was, I was a lieutenant,
Mhm.
and but it was good leadership training, you know, figure out this, he'd been in for a long time and I hadn't, and you know, so just kind of figuring that out, that okay, I'm inexperienced but the boss, he's experienced not the boss, and just how to, so you know, give direction but take the right advice and those kinds of things. So it was great training. And I would keep the budget for the directorate. I would, if we had unfundeds, if we had projects that needed to be funded, I would research them, write them up. We had a board that we went to, and we'd have to advocate for our directorate's projects. And so that was my job, is to do those kinds of things. And then, you know, people get upset, you know, if they didn't get all the money they wanted, and so just explaining, you know, where the resources came from and how maybe their project didn't get funded. And
All right. So when you were working with the master sergeant, what kind of approach did you take? You know, you got this older, established guy, and so forth.
I just tried to listen,
Mhm.
but you know, I needed certain things from him,
Yeah.
and in order for us to be successful, for the entire directorate to be successful, and so I, you know, tried to just be like, it was a team,
Mhm.
but if I needed to give direction, I didn't really hesitate. I mean, I felt like, you know, I had the backing of the director, and yeah, and it worked out.
Good.
It worked out.
I guess a lot of people young officers who go into places say, well, you go and you learn from the non-coms. And they know what's going on.
Absolutely.
And you learn, and there's the point where you kind of really more take over because you've
That's
learned your
right.
job now.
Yeah.
So that's a
I
plus.
definitely, when I first got there, I had a master sergeant that I think he took it upon himself that I was his lieutenant. And we weren't even in the same directorate. But he must have seen something in me, and it was very interesting. I can remember a couple times some advice that he gave me. One was to walk in the middle of the hallway, like you own the place.
Mm-hmm.
The other one was to, if there's another route, but you can take the route that goes by the main office, take the main office route. And, I didn't really think too much about it until much later in my career, and I remember using that advice and it being very useful to know the top leadership and them to know you, even if it's just walking by. And thinking now, I'm like, I actually got a job just because a senior officer saw me and I saluted his car. And it's a weird thing, and I'm sure he did more research than just that, but like, I'd never met him.
Mm-hmm.
I had saluted his car, and he offered me a job one time, and I took that job, and it was a very, it was a good thing.
Okay. So in the first piece of your job there at Patrick, when you were doing the nuclear monitoring, were there particular things that happened or came out that kind of stand out in your memory, or was it a fairly routine thing?
No, there was definitely, we placed sensors in new places during that time to monitor countries that we thought were on the brink of creating materials that might be used for nuclear weapons. And so that was definitely something that was unique. I was able to travel to one of our laboratories that was in New Jersey, near New York City, I remember, and spending, I think, a month and a half almost, just learning the process.
Mm-hmm. And then when you switched jobs, was that just something that was routine to move people around to different assignments, or did you ask for it, or what happened?
No, I think somebody left, and I think I got assigned that. I probably didn't really want to do it, but I was very successful at the first job that they put me in, and I guess they felt like I would be successful as the resource advisor, and yeah, it was good. It was a good...
All right. So you spent a couple of years there, and what happens next?
So I actually would fill in for the colonel's exec occasionally, and one of AFTAC's detachments, which was in the state of Wyoming, had an issue with their commander, not with him specifically, but he had to leave in a hurry because one of his people that worked for him kind of caused some problems. Anyway, the commander there, who was a captain, or was he a major at the time? He might have been a major. Had to leave, and they needed somebody to go TDY to this job. And I was like...
That's temporary duty.
It was temporary, yes, thank you. Temporary duty to this job, which is in the state of Wyoming, middle of nowhere, remote location. And I was like, I want to do this. And I remember the director of the directorate that I worked for was like, Trish, it's a major, you're a lieutenant. And I said, I really want to do this. He's like, okay, I'll put your name forward. And it came back that I didn't get to go to the temporary duty. Like, they picked somebody from a different lab, and it was a captain and whatever, okay. So they were looking for a full-time commander for that detachment. And I remember saying, you know, I want to do that. And the captain they had sent out there was single, and the ratio of women to men there is like 7 men to 1 woman. Anyway, he hated it when he first got there and told people that he didn't like it. And so, you know, while they're like doing the process of, okay, who's volunteering and all that, they knew that he didn't like it. Well, he later liked it and wanted to stay there full time. And I was like, I still want to do this. Like, I know that I'm a lieutenant. I know I'm young. I know that's not normal. But I want to do it. Well, I had been the fill-in exec for the colonel that is over the whole headquarters.
Right.
And I remember at one point I was in the main office, he's TDY somewhere, and he calls, and I just happened to be working late, and he's like, oh, I didn't know that you'd still be there. Yes, sir, you know, just working on some things. And he's like, okay, I see that you volunteered for this job, and you really want to do this. I was like, yes, sir, I really want to do it. And he's like, okay, it's not my full decision. You know, he had to go to General, I think it was Cassiano at the time. And he makes the final decision. I'm like, sir, I understand, but I would like to do that job. And lo and behold, I got selected.
Okay.
And so I'm a first lieutenant, is not normal, you know, for somebody that young to go. It is the middle of nowhere.
Mm-hmm.
I was thousands of miles from my boss. And I was in charge of a 7-person detachment. There were 6 enlisted, me, in the middle of nowhere, basically.
Okay.
I mean, we were 100 miles from the nearest Walmart.
Did you get to talk to the outgoing captain, or did you just find out later?
I did, yeah. He was there when I got there and chatted with them and learned. And it was trial by fire, no doubt about it. But I loved everything about it. Yeah, I loved the location. So the enlisted people that I worked with is 9S100, which is, I can't remember the exact designation, like their formal words for, but it's basically a special systems operator, and they can fix anything. They're like the MacGyvers of the Air Force. Super smart and can do anything. You ask them, they're going to make it happen. And I loved working with those guys. And I told them at the time that if I had gone enlisted, that's a job I would have wanted to do. They travel all over the world. Sometimes they have to wear beards. They have to grow beards because they go into weird locations and fix things. And anyway, it was very cool. There were times where, you know, I remember one in particular enlisted guy, and he and I, it was abrasive, the relationship, because I was the boss and he was from a background that maybe wasn't used to having women as bosses, and having a female engineer, it was just unusual for him. And so we came to an understanding, but it definitely was a leadership challenge for me, and I'm sure a growing challenge for him, just to get along, and not that he had any choice. But yeah, it was a great assignment.
Kind of a general description of what the unit did, where you're basically maintaining and repairing sensors or equipment?
So it's the Pinedale Seismic Research Facility. And so what we did is, one of the ways that we did nuclear treaty monitoring was through seismic arrays. And they're still in existence today. And that is a way that our country monitors for nuclear explosions. and there's a way that seismic waves can show you.
Yeah.
So we were doing research on new equipment that was going to go to the other sites. Our site could do some of the work, but what was really good for, because it was kind of in the middle of nowhere, was doing new seismographs, new seismometers, solar panels, different radio antennas. If they were going to put it in the field, it came to us first, and we would put it through the paces. We had a seismic array that was spread over a 30 square mile area. It was on some Bureau of Land Management land. It was also on a rancher's land, and which was cool because we got to go on roundups, cattle roundups, and I mean, I was on a horseback one time for 12 hours, and I'll never do that again, but it was a great experience. We went to a branding. When they did a branding, they invited us to come be cheap labor, and but it was a beautiful part of the country in the foothills of the Wind River mountain range, and it was great work. We had snowmobiles and a snowcat. We had four-wheelers to be able to get out to the seismic array and do what we needed to do.
Okay, all right. So how long were you there?
I was there for 2 years and would have stayed the rest of my career if allowed. But
Now, what was your original service obligation once you became the officer?
an officer in the Air Force. So the way it works for officers is you're commissioned until you resign your commission.
Okay.
My initial commitment, I guess, I could have resigned after 4 years.
Right.
But honestly, it's the only thing I ever wanted to do. And I couldn't imagine not going 20 plus.
Okay.
There was actually never a time in my career that I ever thought about getting out early.
Okay.
Not a single time. And at A&M, like all my friends are leaving the Corps, and I'm like, I have to stay.
Yeah.
Like, I have to get to the end so that I can be in the Air Force. I had a goal, right? So there was, no matter how bad it was, there was no me quitting, leaving, doing something different. I never even considered, like, I could have transferred to any other college and gone to their ROTC, but it was, Texas A&M is a special place. It has special traditions, and I drank the Kool-Aid, and I was a full-on Aggie, and will be forever, just like I'm a full-on airman.
Yeah. So you became a lifer at that point. So,
I was a lifer.
So you're moving forward with your career. So what's your next assignment then?
So my next assignment was to go to Intel school. So as a nuclear engineer, you're in the acquisition career field. And as a nuclear engineer, there were 5 places in the country, in the world, that I could be assigned. And being out in the field like I was, and I just didn't see myself for 20 years wearing a white lab coat and just being in labs or those 5 jobs. And there had been a colonel at headquarters AFTAC that was in charge of operations, and he was an intel officer. And he told great stories about being in Germany during the Cold War, and they would run his car off the road, and just really good stories. And I was like, I think that's what I want to do. I want to be an intel officer, not run cars off the road or but I just was like, I could see myself doing that kind of work. So I applied for what they call cross-training and got selected. And so for the next year plus, I went to Intel school.
Okay, and where do they hold that?
Goodfellow Air Force Base in Texas, San Angelo, Texas. So that's where I was for the next, it was a little over a year. By the time I went between giving up command at the detachment, I went to Squadron Officer School in Alabama, and then from there went to the Intel, to Goodfellow, and got ready to start Intel school.
Okay. Now, when you're in the Intel school, are the people who are your classmates in effect, are they people like you kind of making career shifts, or are there some of them who are fresh out of academies?
Yes, it was a mixture of all of those things. We actually had a major in our class. I was a captain at the time. There were, I think, 2 other captains. There was a few first lieutenants who had gone to a job, and then sometimes it was special duty and then going to Intel school, and then there was brand new second lieutenants right out of college, and they were becoming Intel officers. And so it was a good mix of all ranks. And
yeah, what kind of curriculum do you get?
They teach you kind of the basics. Okay, so what is intelligence? What are the different kinds? So there's imagery intelligence, signals intelligence, electronic intelligence. There's measurements and signatures intelligence. So they teach you the basics. They teach you about the intelligence community, all the national organizations that make up, and then they teach you airplanes. What we call red recce, or recognition, reconnaissance.
Yeah.
So I would be able to see a MiG-29 in the air and know that's a MiG-29. And so there was some sight viz recce, what we called it. And then the same with like imagery intelligence. They would show you pictures, and you would have to be able to identify certain things. Yeah.
All right.
So
you complete that program. When did you finish that program?
I finished that program in, would have been 90, I guess it was 99, 98 maybe. 99, yeah, March of 99 is when I finished.
All right. And now where do they send you?
They sent me to Korea.
Okay.
And so at the time we were not fighting a war in Iraq. And I was a captain, and I needed to learn fast. I was like, okay, I've got some catching up to do. And the one place you could go where there was what I'd call a slow boil, and always some kind of underlying tension, was Korea.
Okay.
And so I actually had an upperclassman from A&M who was at Intel assignments at the time, and I was like, hey, I want to go to Korea. Whatever, I want to go where I'm going to learn the most. And she's like, no problem. That's not a hard thing to do. So I went to Korea. I was the Intel Systems element lead. So I was in charge of, there was 3 of us. There was myself, an ELINTer, which was electronics intelligence person, who was eccentric. I would just say that. And then there was a kind of he was getting ready to be a tech sergeant, super smart, super funny, and it was the 3 of us. And we were in charge of the Intel computers. Mind you, none of us are trained on computers. We're not computer people. They did at Intel school, they had, I don't know, a 2-3 week class. And there was somebody from the PACAF headquarters that came and gave us some on-the-job training for computers. And so basically, for the next year, I was a computer mechanic. And one of the things when I got ready to leave, they're like, what do you need? You need basic troubleshooting skills.
Mm-hmm.
But who do they send? They send a nuclear engineer to do basic troubleshooting, which worked out great. It was a great assignment. I was also a briefer, so basic intelligence to the wing commander in Korea, and so you would basically give them, okay, what's the current situation?
Right. Now, were you based near Seoul or were you somewhere else?
Based near Seoul at Osan Air Base, Korea, which is the one that's near the city.
Mm-hmm.
There's another air base, Kunsan, that's further south.
All right. And then did you basically kind of get to familiarize yourself with the area and the people and things
Oh,
and
yeah,
kind of get off the
definitely.
base?
We did. I had a friend who was in charge of targeting, and so she and we rode our bicycles all over Korea. And we would go skiing on the weekends, which was quite an interesting thing. It's an entertainment for Koreans, and it looked like landmines laying all over the mountain. It's nothing like in America where it's quiet and peaceful. No, it's like blaring music and it's full-on entertainment. But yeah, got to see a lot of hiked Mount Sorak, which is the highest point in South Korea. Got to go to Punmanjan, which is the DMZ.
Yeah, where the armistice was signed and all of that.
Yep, got to go inside the building into North Korea, right? So you walk over the line and you're in North Korea. So got to do those things and got to visit, a lot of sites in Korea.
Okay. Did you work at all with Korean military personnel or just U.S.?
There were some, but not as much as other units. So I was part of the 51st Fighter Wing and the 51st Operations Support Squadron. And so our intel flight was under that squadron, which was all U.S. There was occasion where we would go, there's some joint units, intel units there, and we would visit occasionally. But we supported our pilots, we supported the wing commander, pretty much just,
Okay.
yeah.
All right. And did you get a feel at all for what it was like to be in a place where there was some tension? I mean, was that part of the atmosphere?
Yes. I remember when I was there, they had what we called the crab wars. So South Koreans and North Koreans were actually like shooting at each other's crabbing vessels and sinking them. And so I remember thinking, look, I'm here 1 year. Don't be starting the next Korean War while I'm here. But they didn't, thank goodness, and they still haven't, thank goodness, because it would be bad. It's not a big place, and there's a lot of firepower on both sides. Yeah, it would be a bad situation.
All right. So when did you finish that tour?
I finished that in 2000.
Okay.
So
And what's your next stop?
next stop was England, to the 100th Air Refueling Wing. And as the Intel Flight Commander, so I was the senior Intel officer for that wing. And it was 9/11 happened while I was in England, and basically shut down the base. I remember getting a call. We're in a vault, basically, think concrete room. All my intel people are in there. Some of the pilots are in there, and one of my friends, one of the navigators, comes in and says, hey, a plane hit the World Trade Center. This guy's a jokester, so I look at him like, really? He's like, no, there's really, it happened. I'm like, okay, the moment I say, okay, to turn around to my intel guys, the battle staff is being recalled. So I'm issue like 3 orders. Call Joint Analyst Center at Molesworth, call the European intel people, find out what's going on. I'm headed to the battle staff. Call me as soon as you know something. So I show up over there. Everybody's looking at me like, what's going on? And I'm like, I know what you know right now. The guys are on the phone. They're finding out what's happening. So everybody went into Delta all around the world. Every base was shut down. I didn't leave the battle staff. It was at least 48 hours, maybe longer. Mm-hmm. And I remember I was sitting in the room with the chaplain. I don't know, everybody else was getting ready. And I watched the first building come down, mm-hmm. thinking, it looks like a movie. Mm-hmm. I cannot believe this is really happening. And then we're just starting to build what's going on? Is it Al-Qaeda? Who is it? What, and then, the intelligence community stands up and figures out, mm-hmm. Over time what happens. And then so the 100th Air Refueling Wing is the flying gas cans. Mm-hmm. We start to send these tankers all over the place. So we had to stand up a detachment in Kazakhstan. We stood up a detachment in Germany. We were sending planes over the Atlantic to bring fighters over to Europe. And so my intel people were spread out all over the place. And then a crypto person would go with them because of the way the planes needed to be coded. Mm-hmm. It was a super busy time. I just remember how busy we were. It was...
Because pretty quickly, the actual invasion of Afghanistan is not too long after that. Within a couple of months, or November, they're going in.
We were bombing places that we knew there were terrorist camps, mm-hmm. where they were training, and it wasn't too long after that we knew that there was more that needed to be done.
Okay, so prior to 9/11 at that base, was there a fairly routine kind of thing?
Yeah. Real routine. There was still the Bosnia-Herzegovina was still simmering, and we still, sent tankers there to refuel things that were happening there. So there was still, it was still fairly busy, but nothing like what happened after 9/11.
Okay. And then how long did you stay in that job?
I was there 2 years. Okay. Yep.
So you left before the actual invasion of Iraq then? Because Iraq was 2003.
Yeah. I was at the Pentagon when we went into Iraq.
Okay. Are there other parts of the story from the 2 years in England that you want to bring in here?
I remember deploying and us not being able to tell where we were going. We didn't know where we were going. We're like, pack your bags, we're going. And we went somewhere for, I don't think I can even say where. It wasn't an unusual place. It wasn't like a hazardous place, but we went somewhere. In retrospect, it was probably just to show for deterrence value, because you're moving big planes, a bunch of people, but I do remember that. And I mean, my parents were used to not knowing where I was and what I was doing anyway, so it wasn't like too unusual for me to fall off the face of the earth for a month or so.
Okay. All right. And when you went to the Pentagon, what was your job there?
So I started off sitting, I was on the Air Force desk at the NMJIC Watch, which is the National Military Joint Intelligence Center. And it was an interesting job, but it was one of the worst jobs I ever had in the Air Force. It was incredibly boring. I was on shift work, but it was not the same shift from week to week, because the person that was in charge of making the schedule just didn't see a need to keep us on any kind of regular schedule. So I didn't know what end was up for about 4 months. And I mean, honestly, messages would come in. Most of the time it was nothing. You would just, and every once in a while it'd be, okay, this is something I need to call someone. I need to wake somebody up for. But that probably happened 2 times in 4 months. I only did it 4 months, and then was selected to be the liaison for security forces. So the intel liaison to the security forces staff at the Pentagon, Air Force Security Forces. There was an OSI liaison, me, and then everybody else was cops, basically, security forces. Yeah. So it was, I was happy to be off the NMJIC watch, I'll tell you that. And working on the security forces, it was a good job. One of the things I remember us doing is we changed the policy. It used to be where you could, if you had a sticker on your car, you could go on to any military base. We changed it where you had to show an ID. You had to show that the person in the car was actually somebody that needed to be on base. Just with the terrorism and all of that thing. So I remember having to brief some senior leaders who weren't too keen on having to stop at the gate and flash an ID. They'd rather their 3 or 4 stars on their window get them through. And we just tried to, let them know that that's probably not the best for the future, for all our safety.
Well, there are many things we can thank Osama bin Laden for, I guess. Yeah. All right. Okay. And then how long did you stay in that job?
I was there for 2 years. Okay. Just almost 2 years. So in 2004 is when I got selected for intermediate developmental education. Most of the time for an Air Force officer, that's Air Command and Staff College, which is in Alabama. But for me, I was selected to get my master's degree at the Air Force Institute of Technology in nuclear engineering. And I remember, so when I was in England, I got a master's degree in international relations, right? Good for an intel officer, right? Okay. It's right up my alley. So I thought, okay, I checked that box, I'm good. Well, the Air Force had decided that I could make it through AFIT and get the IDE credit that way instead of going to Alabama, which I guess freed up the space for somebody else to go to Alabama.
Okay, so where physically were you training then?
I was in Ohio, Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. That's where the Air Force Institute of Technology is. And it's mostly technical degrees. They do have a nuclear engineering program, so that's what I went through. I needed a little bit of remedial math help just to get me up to snuff. It had been a while. But half my class was Army officers, and I might have been the only one in my class that actually had a bachelor's degree in nuclear engineering. Everybody else had math or physics or something like that, so I had a little bit of an advantage. And so it wasn't too hard to get through. It was a civilian institution, a civilian college, your focus is generation of power.
Mm-hmm.
In the Air Force, it was nuclear weapons.
Mm-hmm.
So I learned a different aspect of nuclear engineering.
Okay. Now, what rank are you at this point?
At that point, I am a major. I pinned on major at the Pentagon.
Mm-hmm. All right. And now that you've got your new degree,
Yeah.
what do you do with it?
So then they send me to Fort Meade to be a director of operations for a squadron. And yeah, it is nothing related to nuclear engineering at all. But it was good education, and if anything nuclear were to question were to come up, I was somebody that could help answer the question. So I'm director of operations of a small squadron that provides airmen to many of the offices at the National Security Agency, which does our signals intelligence for DoD. Mostly civilians, but the different services provide people to help with some of the analytical work.
Okay. So what are you doing basically as a commander? Is this kind of a personnel job?
It is a personnel job. I'm director of operations, so there's a commander that I work for, and part of my job was to help that commander be successful. So I remember in one thing in particular, like she would show up late to our physical fitness sessions, and it got to be, all right, I can lose my job over this, but ma'am, I need to talk to you. I go into her office, I close the door, I'm like, you're in charge of this whole squadron. If you want them to show up on time, I didn't even have to get the words out of my mouth. She's like, I know, okay, I got you. I was like, thank you. You're going to make my life easier and your life easier if you'll show up on time. So a lot of times, it's just speaking truth to power and just taking care of people. We had a litany of things, airmen that they were really good at their job but really bad at military stuff, and so helping them either make the decision that the military is not for them, or helping them, with remedial PT or whatever the case may be. We did have airmen that had some mental illness problems and, working through those things. So a lot of it was just taking care of people.
Was this the first time you had a woman as your boss?
No, I had a woman as a boss at the security forces. It was a security forces colonel, female.
Mm-hmm.
There aren't very many of those. And she was a tough nut. Yeah. I remember one time, I thought I was right about something. And so I went in and I was advocating for, I don't even remember what it was, my position. And she, basically, no, that's not what we're going to do. All right, so I don't know. I decide I'm going to take another crack at this. Mm-hmm. And she's like, Trish, we're not doing that. Go sit down. I was like, yes, ma'am, I got it this time. So, yeah, I guess she was the first female boss that I had. I'm trying to remember if there was, no, I hadn't even thought about it.
Was the proportion of women officers increasing? Were you getting more of them and moving higher up, or did it stay about the same the whole time?
There was more. I would say there was probably more starting at the more senior ranks. There was definitely, so that the Air Force didn't have its first female 4-star general until probably 2013, 2014, I think, was the first. And so, yeah, it's, I really hadn't thought about it too much, to be perfectly honest with you, because I just did what I did. I didn't really, my dad was a Marine, you know, my dad was married 3 times. I was with my dad, so I stayed with my dad the whole time. I had been in an all-male at A&M. You know, I'm in an all-female unit, but 99% of the people are men in the Corps. In nuclear engineering, it was me and 1 other female, and everybody else at A&M in our classes was male. Yeah, so it was a very limited exposure to senior women. Yeah.
All right. So we've got that Fort Meade assignment, and then did you change assignments there?
So what happened was that little squadron downsized to a detachment. The squadron commander left, and I became the detachment commander.
Okay.
And there was a bit of a shift in how we were supporting the National Security Agency and supporting the Air Force. And so we were trying to look for places where, and make sure that where we put airmen, that the Air Force was also benefiting from them being in that location. And so there was a bit versus what the National Security Agency, I mean, which is this big behemoth of a organization, it's gigantic. They would rather you just provide them bodies, and they put them where they need them. And but as you know, as the Air Force provider of those bodies, we were trying to be more mindful about where they went and what they did and that kind of thing. And so I did that for, I think, about a year. And then that's where that colonel called me, that I had saluted his car and never met him. And I was a little bit taken aback because I wasn't planning on leaving. I loved this job that I was in as the deck commander. I liked being in charge. I did. I liked having, helping airmen and helping them be as useful as they can be and be their best selves and that kind of thing. So he called and he was like, my director of staff is leaving, and I'd like you to be my director of staff. I was like, mind you, he's never literally talked to me.
Yeah.
And I'm like, okay, I need to talk to my boss, who is in Texas. I'm in Maryland. My boss is in Texas. So I call my boss, and I'm like, hey, sir, Colonel Keffer called me. He wants me to come be his director of staff. And I don't know how I feel about it. Like, I like my job. And he's like, well, let me call him. So my boss called him, and then he calls me back. He's like, well, he wants you to do it, but it's your decision. So you think about it and call me back. And so it was a big job. So this wing is a global wing. They have intel groups all over the world: Korea, Alaska, Germany, and I was like, okay, well, this isn't happening for no reason. I'm gonna go talk to him, and if he thinks I'm the right person, and he literally did not give me a choice. I think he would have hounded my current boss till it was happening. So anyway, I went to be the director of staff for the 70th Intel Wing, and did that for about a year. It was a hard job because basically what you're doing is there's a staff of, you had security people, you had logistics people, you had the finance people, you had the secretaries that supported the two colonels, you had an exec for each of the colonels, and all of those people you were supposed to run herd over.
Mm-hmm.
And they all do different things. And you know, you're right outside, you're the first desk right outside both colonels' offices. And then you got the two secretaries, the other execs right there, and you're the first person the colonels are turning to. They need somebody on the phone, you know, and then the secretaries help you make sure all that's happening. Any paperwork that went into the colonels, either of them went through you. You know, schedules and all that thing, just making sure all that was taken care of. But it was a great job in seeing how colonels operate, seeing how wing commanders operate, seeing what it takes, and seeing how a wing at that level that is global, how it operates. I got to travel with the wing commander and seeing how that worked. I mean, yeah.
Okay. This tape is about up, so we are going to pause here, and I will rewind. All right, now we got in your story to the point where you spent a year as the personnel chief for a particular unit at Fort Meade, Maryland. And I guess that goes into 2008 at this point?
That's right.
Okay.
Yeah. I was director of staff.
Okay. Do you have anything else to add to that story before we go on to your next step? Because you were mentioning traveling places and going places.
Right, yeah. So I've been to Alaska and Hawaii for about 36 hours each. And in Alaska, I did not see the sun. I think I saw the mountains when we were flying in, because the way it works when you traveled with him was you got there as late as you could because you were working the day before. Then you go to work before the sun comes up. You're coming out of work when the sun is already down. You might get a chance to eat something, and then you're off to the next place. So it's like, yes, I've been there, but have I seen anything? No. Except work.
Okay. Now, is this a place that you were looking to move on from, or did you just get another opportunity coming up, or what happened?
So it was time in an Air Force officer's development for me to potentially be a squadron commander.
Okay.
There aren't a lot of opportunities to be a squadron commander, but I had leadership jobs. I had been a director of operations of a squadron. I worked directly for this wing commander, and he advocated for me. And so it's at this point that I was selected to be, I was on the squadron commander list, and then I was selected for one of the openings for a squadron command job. And it was unusual, which is not unusual for me. Everything about my career is a little bit different. I definitely I wasn't a standard intel officer, right? I came in later in my career. I had a different kind of background, different experiences. So anyway, I became the commander for the Air Force Material Intel Squadron. The Air Force Material Command Intel Squadron. And what they do is what we call acquisition intelligence. So the Air Force Material Command builds the next generation of airplanes or computer systems and other things that the Air Force builds. It's the Air Force Material Command, and at the time AFRL was under them, which is the research laboratory for the Air Force. And so this Intel Squadron was responsible for ensuring that these new weapon systems had what they needed to properly operate. For example, the airplanes, the airplanes of today ingest a lot of information, and so they need to be able to determine what all this stuff is, and is it something to be avoided? Is it something friendly that I need to ingest and display? Those kinds of things. And so this Intel Squadron is responsible for getting with the rest of the intelligence community and ensuring that there are identifiers for this wealth of information that is in our environment. And so that's what we were responsible for doing, what I was responsible for. And I had a lot of different, I would say, kind of cats and dogs that worked in this unit. So we had all the different kinds of intel, so signals intelligence expert, an imagery intelligence expert, electronics intelligence. So just we had to have math.
How large a team did you have?
You know, I think there was about 35 of us. It wasn't very big. We also had a little, I would call it a detachment that did a different kind of work that I can't talk about.
Okay.
That was, what I would say, it helped protect future systems. That little detachment, that's what they did. And yeah, so we we would get as much information out of the Air Force Material Command as we could. Sometimes they couldn't tell us the full scope of what we were doing. So now they've released that there's this new bomber, the Air Force is, and that's just been in the news in the last few months. And when I worked there in 2008, 2010, we were preparing for that weapon system. And here we are.
All these years
later. And it's finally being rolled out. So that's how far in advance the Air Force is looking at new systems and preparing for new systems. And that's what we did.
And where were you?
I was at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base.
Back in Dayton?
Back in Dayton, which was kind of fun because I knew people there and I knew, I knew my way around. And that was sort of unusual for me. Normally I go to a new place, I don't know anybody, I don't know how to get around, I don't know where things are. And so that was kind of good. At this point, I actually started living in an RV. When I was at Fort Meade, had a house, but I don't know why, but I decided that I was going to buy an RV and I was going to live in this RV. And that's what I did for the rest of my career. So I lived in a 40-foot motorhome, and everybody, even my bosses, thought I was not right. But it worked. It worked. Everything I owned was in this RV, and it was simple. I bet I was the cheapest move in the Air Force. All they had to do was pay my gas. So everybody else was moving household goods, and I moved it myself. So, but yeah, it was a good, squadron command. Worked for a 4-star general, and she was the first Air Force 4-star general, which was very cool. When she got there, when I worked for her, she was 1-star, and she quickly, I wasn't even there when she made her I might have been there when she made her second star,
Mhm.
but when she made her third star, I wasn't there, and her fourth star, I might have been back at Wright-Pat, but anyway, she's a great lady.
Mhm.
Yeah, wonderful boss. While I was a squadron commander, I deployed to Iraq
Okay.
for 6 months, which again is very unusual. I had a civilian deputy in my squadron who had been there for eons. Otherwise, I never could have left the squadron. But I was able to leave. I got selected to deploy, and I probably could have gotten out of it.
Mhm.
Because I was a squadron commander. It was just a weird thing. But that's what we do.
Mhm.
And I wanted that experience, and you know, I wanted to go, and so I did. I went to Iraq for 6 months.
When were you there?
I was there from 2008, so August 2008 to February 2009.
Okay, so that's not too long after you started
Yes.
with the squadron that you went to.
Yeah, I had just been there 3 months. And
And where did you stay in Iraq?
I was on Camp Slayer,
Okay.
which is where, I don't know if you know anything about it. It's where the Perfume Palace is, and the U.S. military had taken over the Perfume Palace and turned it into the Combined Operations Intelligence Center.
Now, was this near Baghdad, or was it?
Yes, it was on the outskirts of Baghdad.
And what is the Perfume Palace?
So the Perfume Palace was the place that Saddam Hussein kept his concubines. That's why it was called the Perfume Palace.
That's why they found the Viagra in his possessions. Okay.
Yeah. And so I worked in the Perfume Palace. I lived in what they call a CHU, container housing unit. I was a lieutenant colonel at the time, and myself and another female lieutenant colonel shared a bathroom, but we each had our own room, our own container, I guess.
Yeah.
I was the deputy chief for analysis production, and basically what we did, we were on the second floor, and we had intel from almost every intelligence agency in America.
Mhm.
The ones I worked with the most were the DIA, Defense Intelligence Agency analysts, and they were the expert on the people they knew, the situation, whether it be the Sunni or the Shiite, they were the experts.
Mhm.
We all worked for a one-star female Army general who tried to kill us, basically. She didn't sleep. I think she drank nothing but Diet Coke. We could sometimes get her to eat some bacon. I think she might have eaten chocolate and pizza. I mean, literally a force of nature.
Mhm.
And so I have this job that I'm supposed to do, which is basically to keep her abreast of situation and then prepare a once-a-week briefing to General Petraeus and his commanders. So he's prosecuting the Iraq War.
Mhm.
And our job is to provide him with a strategic operational briefing. Once a week, it was Sunday mornings. And so we spent all week getting this briefing ready. Get it through her. She would basically rewrite the whole thing. It was never exactly what the analysts would say,
Mhm.
but it, she made it for his consumption.
Mhm.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't have a day off in 6 months. Not a Saturday, not a Sunday. There were days I didn't sleep. There were
Okay.
days I didn't eat. I mean, it just was what it was.
Mhm.
And
And if that's a period when Petraeus was there, and there's a fair amount of activity going on at that point, because he's trying to get the whole situation under control.
yep, and his commanders are literally, we're in a room no bigger than this. He's sitting right there, the 1-star's right there. The main briefing analyst is sitting one more seat away. I'm at the end of the table, praying all goes well. There are the other commanders, there might be a couple other analysts
Mhm.
in the back. And then 3 stars, 2 stars, 1 stars packed in wherever they could find a seat.
And what you're doing is really kind of a joint services sort of thing where you're gathering all kinds of intelligence and processing.
Yes.
So it's not just sort of an Air Force thing for the
No,
benefit of the Air
as a matter of
Force.
fact, it wasn't Air Force
Yeah.
thing. I mean, there might be a hint of Air Force stuff in there, but it was mostly Army.
Mhm.
I mean, it's based on field intelligence that's coming in, or, but there's other stuff that we're getting, and we are definitely feeding it into, whether it be CIA, DIA, NSA, wherever we can get it. We're trying to feed him the most current, the most accurate, although some of it was what it was. So this is what we know. The information is suspect, and we're trying to verify. General Petraeus was brilliant. Besides the trouble he got into later, right? But brilliant, strategic mind.
Mhm.
He would email the analysts, the line analysts directly. And I remember analysts like running across the floor, General Petraeus just emailed me, what do I do? Write him back. And courtesy copy our boss,
Mhm.
So just write it back. He's got a question, answer his question. And make sure you send the same answer, just courtesy copy our boss, and you'll be fine, just answer correctly. And I remember briefers would come out of having spent time with the 1-star crying. And so I was like their mom. I'm like, okay, what happened? Okay, what did she tell you? Okay, all right, so let's start from the top. Okay, what did she say to change? Okay, what did she say? And just, okay, one step at a time. Let's work through this, and just, it's gonna be okay. I know it's hard, some of these are kids,
Mhm.
but they're the expert.
Yeah.
And they end up in Iraq.
Mhm.
They've never been away from home, and they just don't know how to handle it. So it's just helping them through it.
Oh.
And yeah,
So that's a pretty intense experience.
it was very intense. It was, yeah.
But that was something with a fixed time limit for how long you're going to be there, was it the 6-month assignment? and then-
For me, it was
Yeah.
a 6-month assignment.
Okay.
Yep.
All right.
For
You get-
some of them, it was longer.
Okay. Then you get to go back to Ohio.
Yeah.
And life changes totally at that point.
Yep.
Okay.
It was
All right.
definitely changed. So.
All right. So after being the squadron commander, what's next for you?
So after I left there, I went to be a deputy group commander, which is kind of the next step
Mhm.
in your progression in leadership. And so it was another NSA job, National Security Agency
Mhm.
job. It was in Augusta, Georgia. And it was the NSA, part of the NSA apparatus that deals with CENTCOM. So Central Command, which is the Middle East, so it's Iraq and it's Afghanistan and it's all the things that are happening there. So I worked for a colonel, I'm a lieutenant colonel there. Moved my RV from Ohio to Georgia, and it was during this time that they found Osama bin Laden, and then you know what happened with that. So that was a pretty exciting time at that unit. I also volunteered to deploy to Afghanistan during that assignment. So they had a unit called the Afghanistan Remote Operations Cryptologic Center, and it had an Army officer in charge of it. And for some reason, the Army officer was leaving, and a new one was being selected, either hadn't been selected or something happened and they had a gap. And so I remember in a couple meetings, they're like, hey, we need somebody to go TDY. And here I'm an airman. I work for this colonel, and twice I sit in a meeting and I hear the same thing. And in the back of my mind, I'm like, yeah, I need to volunteer for this. And I don't really want to, but it's like, okay, twice. I'm gonna go, let me talk to my boss. And so I go to the colonel, I'm like, I feel like I should volunteer for this. He's like, I don't know if his boss will let me go. And I'm like, well, I can't control that, so, if he'll let me go, I will volunteer to go do this. I think it was for 3 months or something, 3 or 4 months. It wasn't for very long, but sure enough, they're like, okay, you can go. And so off to Afghanistan I go. And
where are you based?
I'm based in Bagram.
That's the big air base there.
It's the big air base. We called it Area 82. So it basically had the 3-letter intel agencies had this area. That was like a special area, had special guards and things like that. And so I was in that, lived in another CHU, another container housing unit, but it was nicer. This one was pretty nice, had my own bathroom in my little container. Didn't have to share with anybody. And I ran this unit that basically was the intel portion of the Predator operations. And we were helping do hunter-kill operations. And a lot of linguists, so people from Pakistan, Afghanistan. I had somebody from Turkey was there that spoke Arabic, Pashto linguist. So it was a melting pot, and it was very interesting because they don't get along, and they all had to live in close proximity. And I had young lieutenants that were like, okay, that's their responsibility, is taking care of the linguists and making sure they get to work on time and all this stuff. And just helping them with that personal dynamics. At the time, we were trying to figure out how to do this operation that we were doing remotely from the U.S., and where do we need to do it? What does it need to have? Those kind of things. So we were working on moving it out of Afghanistan so that it could be run from the U.S. versus there. Yeah, it was definitely interesting. You know, it was hard. I remember a helicopter that went down. 19 people lost their lives, and a K9 was lost in that crash. And remember the coffins coming onto Bagram, and the ceremony loading them onto the C-130s. I don't know if they had a C-17. They might have had a C-17. I'll never forget it.
When you're in these places, whether it's Iraq or Afghanistan, do you have any kind of feel for how the larger campaign is going, or is anyone making any progress, or are you just doing a job and not really looking up?
It depends. In this particular case, it was pretty tactical what we did. There was some strategic value, but yeah, for the most part, I did have one of my old bosses visit, and he kind of laid it. I don't even know what he was doing at the time. He must have been, I don't know where he was, but anyway, he knew the overall layout of what was happening, and so he kind of, you know, shared with us a little bit about what was happening there. But we were, I mean, literally very tactical. I remember after that helicopter went down, we were looking who did it, and yeah.
Okay. All right. And so you have your 3-4 months there.
Yep. And then I
out.
go back to Fort Gordon, and you know, basically finish up my time there. It was a, you know, good assignment. And then from there, I got selected to be the Air Force Fellow at Oak Ridge National Lab, and you know, my nuclear background. And they have a global security directorate at Oak Ridge that tries to interface with the DoD, and so the Air Force sends fellows to different places, and that was my senior developmental education. Instead of going to Air War College, like a normal airman, I got selected to be the senior fellow at Oak Ridge. And there was a major there also at the same time I was, and he was doing some research and getting his IDE credit, or intermediate developmental education credit. So it was very cool, very, very cool to be at a place where the Manhattan Project, you know, got a lot of work was done on the Manhattan Project, and just to get to interface with quantum scientists and material scientists, and you know, people on the cutting edge of research was great. And just learning how they do business so that I could help the Air Force tap into that knowledge and that research. And yeah, it was great. 1 year I did a little bit of research on small nuclear reactors, which maybe someday, you know, there'll be an appetite for that in our country. So if we can ever figure out the fusion.
And for you, was this more a training thing, or was there kind of a regular job you were doing?
I would call it a training thing. I mean, my day-to-day was, so I had this research project that I was working on, so I was doing research for that, but then me and the major that was there, we would tour Oak Ridge, and we would call and set up, hey, we want to come see the nuclear reactor, we want to see where the plutonium was made. We would tour all over. I did a little bit of work at the nuclear reactor there, and just helping them work on a project. And so I went through their their training for radiation exposure and all of that. So that was good. They, treat you kind of like an employee and just help them where you can, and then you're doing your own research, and yeah, it was really cool.
Okay, and it's a stepping stone toward becoming full colonel?
It is. Getting to do some kind of senior developmental education it's not required necessarily, but most people that make 06 do have some kind of SDE. Or senior developmental education, and so it definitely was something that I wanted to do, to have an opportunity to potentially make 06.
Okay, and then now you get another assignment after that.
Yeah, so I remember my boss calling me and saying, well, I got selected to be a colonel there. So I was on the list. So I was just, someday I'm going to get promoted to colonel. So I knew when I was at Oak Ridge later in the assignment that I had got picked, what we call picked up to be 06. And I remember my boss, was it my boss at the time or my soon-to-be boss, and said, it's your payback. And so they sent me to Fort Belvoir, another Army base, which in my mind is Air Force appreciation tours, because you really learn to appreciate Air Force quality of life when you're at a different services installation. But so yeah, and I was part of, it was really 3 different units. And so I was triple hatted. So Defense Threat Reduction Agency, DTRA, at Fort Belvoir. And then there was a STRATCOM unit, which was the Strategic Command Center for Combating Weapons of Mass Destruction. Okay, so that is a STRATCOM, which is in Omaha, Nebraska, but this little unit at Fort Belvoir. And then there was a Standing Joint Force Headquarters for Elimination of Weapons of Mass Destruction, which is this joint unit. So it had an Army general that was in charge of it. So, and he was dual-hatted, so he was the STRATCOM boss and this joint unit, the Standing Joint Force Headquarters. And then I worked for an Air Force general that was in Omaha. So I had like 2-3 bosses. But while I was there, we got the chemical weapons out of Syria. So that whole operation was through these units and others. It took the Navy, it took a lot of different organizations to get those out. But our little intel unit was helping do that. So that happened while I was there. No other.
Okay. And when do you finish that assignment then?
So I finished that in June of 2015.
Okay. And then do you have one more slot after that?
I do. So then my last assignment in the Air Force is as Vice Wing Commander of the National Air and Space Intelligence Center. And the wing commander is a colonel, and I'm a colonel, and I go to be the Vice Wing Commander. And basically the way we described it, and it was a female colonel who was, she's now a 3-star general. She was the wing commander when I got there, and then a different commander took over for her a year after I'd been there. But she was the one who was shaking hands and kissing babies, and I was making sure the wing was running.
Okay.
So she and the colonels, the bosses, they're part of it's politics in terms of and helping the Air Force understand what that big wing does. So it's about 4,000 people, airmen and civilians, and they are, that unit knows everything there is to know about any major weapon system that is similar, so a major airplane, a major missile, any kind of air-to-air weapons. This unit is the expert. They build models, electronic models. They can build real models if needed. I mean, they know it down to the ones and zeros and the nuts and bolts. They also have a foreign military exploitation part where they'll bring in systems and learn how they work. They did open skies work. They're the ones that brief the president. If there's some major weapon system that has an Air Force equivalent, it's NASIC that knows and will go brief the president on what's happening. They also have a bit of a tactical mission. One of the units there was helping, support tactical operations, whether it be Iraq or Afghanistan. And they have space units there now. So the new Space Force has stood up, and part of that came out of NASIC. Yeah, I remember it was the best assignment, hands down, which is why I retired.
Okay.
The next job I would have done is most likely go be a staff officer somewhere, and I had a great assignment at NASIC, and I thought it was time for me to be done, and so I retired out of NASIC, but I remember sitting in a briefing and just sitting back in my chair going, wow, it's unbelievable what we can do. And good assignment.
Okay. How do you characterize kind of climate for women in the Air Force over the course of your career? You may have been able to shrug off a certain amount of stuff from the men because you were used to them.
Yeah.
But
I found it mostly inviting. There were very few instances. I had the one instance in Wyoming where I had a subordinate that had never had a woman boss. It didn't know that I was just like his male bosses, When I first joined, there were times where, I was in an office and they were being boys, where now I would have said, knock it off. Then I didn't know to say knock it off. It didn't bother me enough to complain about it, but it's changed a lot. And as a senior leader in the Air Force, I never would let any of that happen. If I was aware of it, I would be like, that's inappropriate.
were you aware ever of episodes of sexual harassment or other things like that going on with any of the units you were involved in, or was that not at your radar?
There were times where things would happen that we would have to address them. And, I remember, I don't even know when it was, but, the whole, like, you can't have that calendar up. There was a point you know, while I was in, where, okay, we got to make this an inviting place for all people, not just the male side of things. So, you know, that was happening, and it is what it is. You know, it's not appropriate. Take it down. Take it down. It's not allowed. Take it down.
All right. So, what year did you retire?
I retired in 2017.
Okay. And what have you done since?
So, initially, I went to work for a nonprofit here in West Michigan, which is why I moved to a very cold place. And the reason I'm still here is because I got married. And my husband is still working, and so we're here. Probably, we love the spring, summer, and fall. It's a beautiful place. And honestly, it's snowing right now. It is beautiful now, but it's awful cold. And the winters are long, and there's no sun.
All right. Okay. Well, you have a remarkable story, and I very appreciate your taking the time to share it today.
Well, thank you for allowing me.
Okay.